morning to everybody. I am Alessandra Venturini, the holder of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Migration Study. We are very glad to open the third series of the seminar Cocumint, Consumption of Cultural Goods as Driver of Migrant Integration. This year, the seminar has a special focus. We inquire into the inclusion of foreign artists, and we select the contemporary art field because it is one where the linguistic differences play a smaller role, while the cultural differences remain. But as well, they play a different role. We notice that for a foreign artist, breaking through in the contemporary art is easier than, for instance, in other fields, the literature, for instance, and so on. We want to inquire also how the different actor, curator, director of the museum, of the art gallery, president, or owners constrain the accessibility of foreign artists in public arena. I do not want to lose time in the introduction. I introduce briefly the speaker, Giuliana Setari, who was with us also in the previous edition, interviewed for us Michelangelo Pistoletto Marinella Senatore, who is an important Italian contemporary art collector, the president of the Dena Foundation, and with which she promoted young artists, the president of Città dell'Arte Foundation. And also Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, who is an Italian-American writer, an art historian, and exhibition maker. She received the award for the Curator of Excellence. Currently, she is the director of the Castello di Rivoli Museo d'Arte Contemporanea and the Fondazione Cerruti. She was also the artistic director of Documenta in Casen, and she was holding a seminar exhibition in Alessandria, in Kabul, but her stewardship of Documenta renewed one of the exhibition primary intention, and for that reason we choose her. So to enlist culture as an agent of reconstruction, healing, and dialogue. So I leave to you, Giuliana, the flow to lead the conversation with Carolyn. And both of you, thanks a lot for participation.
And me too, I would like to thank Alexandra for inviting me for the third time, and Carolyn for accepting this invitation. And I got in the center of your introduction because you address your topic for this third part of Cocumint to curators and directors. I would like to ask Carolyn, along her very, very prestigious career, has covered both roles, curator and director of cultural institutions. I would like to ask her to clarify which difference between the two roles, but especially concerning the possibility, the choice that she was able to make regarding the invitation, the choice of artists, the invitation of artists to her exhibitions, her events. So what is the best for you, to be a curator or to be a director?
Dear Giuliana, dear friend Giuliana, and I'm happy to receive your question as it opens up many, many possibilities. I would also like to thank the university for their invitation to your seminar online. I think being a director and being of a museum and being a curator are two quite different things. As a director, I spend 90% of my time working on organizational matters and funding issues. But from the perspective of guiding, let's say, the knowledges, the legitimation artists, and therefore the inclusion of artists who are so-called foreign, which I would like to explore with you, this word, for a moment, one has more impact, of course. As an independent curator, one is not involved, for example, in acquisition of works. So if you're acquiring works for a permanent collection from a museum, you can change the reading of the present in the future. In other words, if one is including, for example, artists of the Global South, if one is including in the museum collections artists from different parts of the world that are not canonical to the art historical tropes of the location of the museum, you're actually changing art history in a very strong way. Because what matters really in museums is the collection. I mean, in the long run, that is the basis on which we can tell the story of the past. Had the past been different, for example, in the 19th century, had it not been a colonial past and therefore a colonial construction, we would not have thousands and thousands of objects in museum collections today in Europe that are being restituted. So it is behind the scenes, but it is a very powerful role. While being a curator has to do with hypotheses, it's more like a researcher, and you throw out hypotheses of possible readings of what is important to knowledge formation in the world. Generally, as a curator of contemporary art, you end up doing biennales, the so-called periodic exhibitions of art that are held around the world in different cities and that developed very much after the 1980s in parallel to globalization. Of course, the Biennale of Venice existed since the late 19th century, and the Biennale of Sao Paulo since 1955, and Sydney since 1973 in Australia. But the main impulse to the biennalization of the world is after 1989. And now we have hundreds of biennales around the world, and curators are often involved in organizing those. And those are where a certain experiment was held. This experiment had to do with the meeting of cultures. Let's say what in the 1980s was called multiculturalism, and it changed its definition and the wording changed over the years. But those platforms from Gwangju, which happened after the major revolution and democratization of Korea, to Havana, to Shanghai Biennale, to Johannesburg, certain editions, to Istanbul, especially Istanbul, they became territories, territori di confine, boundaries, where certain experiments of a kind of new internationalism were possible. So that's the answer to your first question. But I think it's important, if you don't mind, to stop a second on this word, foreign, because I don't know exactly what it means. I mean, as a feminist, everything is sort of foreign and sort of not foreign. We grow children in our bodies, and are they foreign or are they not foreign? It's unclear. So I think that the word foreign is not a very useful word to use today anymore. Straniero.
What would you use? What would you use?
Well, we can't even say, that an artist is from Africa. What does that mean? Or from Norway? What does that mean? Is it because they're born there? What does it mean? I mean, it's a construction of otherness, which I have never accepted. I'm a curator of Documenta who invited more Arab artists than any other preceding Documenta. But I would not have said they're foreign to Germany, you know. When I organized the the Sydney Biennale, I remember it was the exhibition that the Sydney Biennale edition showed Australian Aboriginal artists than any edition before. And I remember an Australian person, maybe a collector, maybe a curator, asking, but why did you not invite any or very few Australian artists? And I said, but I invited so many. There are like 20 Australian Aboriginals. And they said, oh, but I mean, you know, and then ... So what does that mean? White Australian artists, descendants from the immigrants, from the poor people who were thrown to Australia in the 1700s for having stolen a piece of bread. So they are the foreigners. So are the foreigners the white Australians? According to Richard Bell, maybe they are, you know. Richard Bell is the famous, very famous Aboriginal activist artist. Will do a major work in the Turbine Hall at Tate in a few weeks, and was exhibiting at Castello di Rivoli last year. But for maybe white Australia, maybe the foreigners are the Aboriginals, but they were descendants from indigenous peoples who lived there for the last maybe 25,000 to 40,000 years. But they're black and proud to be black and to say they're black. So what does foreigner mean is I think the problem, if there is a problem, is that Europeans construct the concept of the foreigner. They constructed it, and therefore they have to construct also the idea of inclusion of foreigners, which is a perverse, in my view, idea, because it's grounded on the fact that you are identifying somebody else as not foreigner. But everyone is a foreigner. I mean, 99.99% of the Europeans are descendants from immigrants coming from the Germanic peoples, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Longobards. How many people are somehow indigenous to Italy, you know, a direct descendant of Etruscans? I don't think very many. Or and even the indigenous people of Italy, like the Liguri are Celts, the Celts, you know, and way back to prehistoric times were all, I guess, African or maybe Chinese. I haven't kept up with the research, but so I do not premise my work on the issue of inclusion of foreigners. I never have, and I find that problematic. But people who do look at my work and who know me very well, like Giuliana, know that I was the first person to work, except for my dear friend in Ireland, first person to really, well, together with also Jan Hoot in Belgium, but to work, one of the first people to work with Jimmy Durham, for example. Right, for example. And he moved to Italy because I introduced him to all our friends, you know, to Mario Pieroni.
Was the exhibition.
Yes, Città Natura. So let's put it this way. Strangely enough, I've got a pretty good record, a pretty good track record of being inclusive, because being a feminist, I've always felt excluded from a male world. I remember as a young woman, a young curator, I used to have coffee and drinks with David Hammonds quite often. He was one of my mentors, let's say, like the Actipovera artists. And you know, we used to talk about the analogies between being a woman at the time and being black, and so my thinking has been shaped by people who have worked at the forefront of something which I do not wish to define.
And
I mean,
I want to,
something.
and here I come, because I would like to know if in this process of shaping your thinking, what was the contribution of your own origin, your own family? Because you have an Italian mother, a Bulgarian father, you were born in the United States, you study at the Lycée Français, the university in Pisa. So all this variety of elements, how they influence your own personal and professional experience and development, in which extent they contribute to make your mind, you know what I mean? Exactly what you were saying. So this was, I think this is the origin. Then you shape it with the encounter, David Emmons and the others.
Yes.
Is that possible,
Well,
that origin of yours?
Yes. Well, actually, that's a really, really, really good question. It's amazing, Giuliana, because I don't usually talk about my own biography. I always talk about artists, and I mention artists and my meetings with artists and my life with artists. But it is true that you could say that I'm a foreigner to everywhere. If we want to, I mean, it is true that as a child, I used to spend 6 months in America and 6 months in Italy, you know, from May to September, because there were these very long holidays. Maybe it was 8 months and 4 months. And since I was born, and in Italy, I felt like that I was treated as a foreigner. I was an American. And in America, I felt that I was treated as a foreigner, as an Italian. And indeed, I speak English with an accent, and I speak Italian with an accent. So I thought I might as well multiply that. So now I speak many, many languages with accents, French and German and terrible Spanish, but accents. And so it probably you're right. Probably there was a personal story. You know, my father escaped from Bulgaria when he was 18 years old, and he had nothing. He crossed the border and lost his papers and changed his name to Christov. His name was Bakargiev, and he had nothing, not one penny. And he managed, you know, he met my mother on a bus in Genoa, Nervi, asked her for money to buy a ticket, and then asked her for her phone number to give her back the money. And that they struck up a relationship, and he ended up achieving a great degree in medicine in Italy. And then because he was a foreigner, he was unable to practice medicine in Italy. It was a strange paradox where the Italian government gives you a degree in medicine, but does not allow you to practice medicine. Crazy. I think today it's not like that anymore. I hope so. So he flipped a coin, you know, heads I go to Brazil and tails I go to New Jersey, and tails came out. So I was born in New Jersey.
Bridgewood.
State where William Carlos Williams is from. And he wrote Patterson, and also very close to Walt Whitman in many ways. And Walt Whitman was a great poet and Democrat, revolutionized poetic language and opened it to many other sounds. Let's say the sounds of nature, the sounds of plants, the sounds of wind, the sounds of different people. One of the poets, it's very interesting that you asked me that question, because one of the poets I loved the most as a young woman, and I indeed studied linguistics and philology and glottology, and so emerging languages and so on. One of my favorite poets as a young woman was Ezra Pound. And Ezra Pound, you know, that everybody's worried about being right wing and that because he did the radio programs during fascism in um, in support of Mussolini. I find those discussions totally stale and superficial and silly, to be honest. If Ezra Pound was anything, he was a Confucian, who believed in Confucianism and politics that descend from Confucianism. But what he did in his work was to revolutionize poetic language by including in it both Greek and Latin words, Chinese words, and words from all over the planet to build a kind of new poetic language, a new modernist poetic language. So in Ezra Pound's work, we really see the internationalism of the early 20th century. Now, your colleague from the university who did production, she mentioned something about art being an easier field to approach a kind of global world, an inclusive world, which is inclusive because you don't have the language barriers. I found that very interesting because it is true. It is true that visual art and sound art doesn't have the barriers of not speaking the same language. So I found that extremely interesting. It is the same concept that was expressed after World War II by the great curators of the time. The founding of Documenta and so on, and also great exhibitions in Holland that were held with Lucio Fontana and other artists of the 20th century after to avant-garde. They clearly stated in text that art was an international language, was a visual and international language that everyone could use. And in particular, they authorized and legitimized abstraction. So not only visual arts, but art that was not figurative. So no representation of bodies and black bodies, white bodies, and so on. They were not, and also culturally contingent environments in a figurative painting, like the furniture or the vases or whatever you have in the background of the painting. They felt that those figurative paintings were too defining of others as others. And they believed that abstract art was the way to go towards this totally free and totally international language that everyone could speak. And those were the great dreams also. People like Rudolf Arnheim, people who worked in the field of the psychology of perception, you know, the deep structures of a painting, the diagonals, the push and pull, the fundamental forms. When I did the Documenta, however, I remember contesting Arnheim and this concept because I felt that human culture was othering and was excluding non-human culture. So as you know, are bees foreigners? You know, the question of bees and dogs. And I introduced Donna Haraway to the art world, basically. She was one of my consultants. She was part of the advisory committee. And I created a house for her called the Worldly House. But that Documenta really spoke to the fact that speaking about foreigners only within the human realm is also a problem, because there are also fish in the world. They're not just humans. So this question of the boundaries of of self and other, or non-foreigner, foreigner, if you think about it philosophically, it has no boundaries. It's a question of scale. It's a question of scale. If you speak on a very small scale, you can say that neutrons and protons are kind of foreigners to each other, or that the positive and negative of a cell, inside, that causes the passage of information. If there wasn't that difference, the difference in electrical difference, we wouldn't be able to have brain cells work. And then, so that's a small scale. But if we go to a cosmic scale, maybe black holes are foreigners. I don't know. I mean, what does it mean? So this discussion of foreign, non-foreign, in my view, must be seen within a broader, let's look at it this way. We have to define the parameters of what we're talking about. And once we define the parameters, we can speak within those parameters. So if you and I today are speaking about a certain scale, which is the scale of a human body, and therefore, and we're speaking about a certain context, which is the relations between humans on this planet, then we can speak about multiculturalism and all those things, that an inclusivity of artists from different parts of the world. We can do that. But we must understand that we are making an arbitrary choice of containing the problem within those parameters. Now, if you speak to artists, they will never accept that. For example, if you speak to Otobon Nakanga from, Nigeria, she lives in Antwerp, and her work is about how entangled the question of, let's say, social and political relations are with the relations with materials. So, I'm sorry, excuse me. The relations with materials, meaning the relations between the extraction of certain minerals in Africa for our computers, and the social relations that go on. Would there have been slavery, for example? Would there have been slavery? I'm sorry for all this background noise. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Slavery is just as much a history of humans as it is a history of materials, and the exchange and needs of materials in certain places, because of the history of technology and the history of industry. So I never look at humans without looking at why matter matters. And most artists will do that also. So I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure I did.
Well, no, you did, because it's very comprehensive. What are you saying? Very much indeed. And you answer also the following question that I wanted to make to you. But now it's what interests the seminar, the Cocumint, is precisely something that perhaps you don't like. Try this kind of inclusiveness, migration. How the institution can answer to this question. Because, for instance, we know that what you have done with your participation, your curating of Biennale, Sydney, Istanbul, Documenta, now so many exhibition with so many foreign artists, as we continue to use this word that you justamente you don't like.
Yeah, for the purpose of this seminar.
Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, we have to understand what can be the part of an institution in this process. Okay? Is by the Department of Education, is he inviting these artists? You always invited artists from other countries. You always shared political, societal, economical issues that were of these artists. But as an institution, you have to, in a way, give a shape to all this interest, curiosity. How you can manage to do this?
Yeah. Well, I cannot speak for all institutions, obviously, but I think it's a very, very important task. Museums, I mean, institutions in terms of museums, I'm not speaking about universities and other kinds of institutions. The history of museumology, let's say, museums really took a specific turn in the late 1960s. First of all, in parallel with a certain turn in art history, people started to stop. That's funny. Telling the story of kings and queens and battles, and they started to apply a more social history of art. So at the same time as you have Arnold Hauser, actually earlier in the 50s, but many other great art historians starting to tell an anonymous story of peoples and the development of peoples, peoples in the plural, let's say. You have the museums also shifting from the chef-d'oeuvre of the great, Delacroix, to also giving more value and reading through the history of pottery, history of craft, a more collective social history of art. So the museums played a very important role in that, because they shape also value systems of the visitors. The question of changing, let's say, what you're referring to more directly is the rereading and changing of art historical narratives and the critique and collapse of what was called Eurocentrism. That happened, let's say, from the 1980s onwards, and many museums around the world have changed the displays of the collection. When they have historical works, for example, in Canada was one of the first countries to do work in terms of reorganizing the way that the museum collections were displayed. And just because a work is by an anonymous, for us, artist, because the concept of authorship was not present in the way that it was in Europe. Just because an object was made by an unknown particular person, Sami, it doesn't mean that painting object cannot be placed next to a very well-known artist, according to the European concept of authorship and subjectivity, individual subjectivity. So that was a kind of first shift. And institutions have since then, museum collections strongly challenged their previous way of showing collections to be more open and inclusive of works from all over the world. At this point, we have to speak of, we are now in a subsequent era. We're in a new era. I would say it's the post-COVID era, and it's the post-Black Lives Matter era. And it's a very, very different moment, and it's very difficult for me to speak about it because it's so close to us and it's complicated. Let's say that the post-COVID era brought to an acceleration of the digital and the digitalization. Which was happening anyway, but it just happened more.
Very, very quickly.
Very quickly, it accelerated. And digitalization and social media don't actually, well, they do two things. One, they produce bubbles. They produce identities that are very identifiable in a group of people that belong to that bubble. And that think that the whole world is in the same bubble. This is connected with artificial intelligence and predictive basically algorithms that predict behavior and choices. Those are applied statistics, and they are embedded with so-called biases, obviously, because somebody writes them at the beginning. But the production of these bubbles has created more divisions, in my view, than there were before. So I'm being extremely controversial now, and I don't know how this will go on the internet. Could cause a problem, but I do not see, as most people do, this as an achievement of decreasing the closure of a traditional art world towards foreigners. And I don't see it as a gain in terms of a new form of internationalism and a new form of inclusivity. What I see with the digital is after this COVID period, is an increase of identities, even when we're speaking about multiple identities at the same time, intersectionalities. What I see is people claiming these multiple identities and claiming this intersectionality in ways that can be ultimately problematic for world history. We might end up in wars. Because the question, there's a boundary, there's a very delicate boundary between including so-called others, including artists of foreign passports. Let's use the word foreign just to speak with, as a way of saying passports that are not, place that you're entering. I do not see this increase in identification as equivalent to an increase in inclusivity. I actually think that it may bring to divisiveness. Divisiveness.
Yeah.
There were more women in my documenta than any other documenta before, but I didn't say it's a feminist exhibition. I never said that, so ultimately I believe I'm a skeptic. So to make a long story short, I ascribe to the philosophical current of skepticism, which, the ancient Greeks of the time of Alessandro il Magno, Sextus Empiricus, were skeptics, and skeptics traveled, all over and saw different habits and customs and things all over, all the way to what is Afghanistan today. And those skeptics were relativists. So they believed that there were no absolute truths. There were only relative truths to a certain community, to a certain people, to a certain age, to a certain culture at a certain time. And the history of skepticism then runs through the Western philosophy. I'm situated in the Western culture. I didn't grow up in a non-European culture, so I can only speak from my situated position. The skepticism went through Montaigne, and then went through many people, all the way through Deleuze, certainly many philosophers and feminists later, but also male philosophers. So for me, relativism is very important, paramount. And the boundary between relativism and moral relativism, the boundary that one needs to keep clear. It's very dangerous. You can fall from relativism into moral relativism very easily, which means saying it's fine to, kill a cat. No, it's not fine to kill a cat. So, moral relativism is the risk, but relativism is the way, la via.
It's the only way, probably.
Yeah, it's the only way to navigate a very complex world. But anyway, so what I'm saying ultimately is that institutions, when they name solution, they create the problem. So one must not name the solution. One must not say, I'm going to show at least 50% women artists, at least 20% artists from Africa, at least 10% artists from indigenous artists from around the world in my programs from now on. No, the minute you say that, you are falling into an authoritarian philosophy and an authoritarian position, which is very close to fascism's. So you must not ever, in my view, this is just my view,
Yeah.
but an institution that actually practices. So it's the point is practicing things, not talking about them. You practice inclusivity, you practice rights, and you practice multiple knowledges, you practice. You don't define it as a institutional
As a program, as a program, as a program, as a program.
That's my view. Yeah, that's my view.
Yeah, because what we have been seeing lately, some years ago, is just this programming. Yeah? This, as you say,
I mean, not just. We have seen also great, steps forward, like Carrie James Marshall, is as important as Jackson Pollock now. But so we have seen great changes, and the best of them have happened without programmatically doing it. The problem is language, is naming. Like, oh, I'm so good. That's horrible. It's horrible.
Yeah, very much indeed.
So it's difficult. It's difficult. It's a difficult exercise that the institutions need to do. You have to, and they do it. They change slowly or rapidly sometimes, and they change naturally. They don't change, putting it in a press release.
They should change naturally. That would be the best way. I don't know if Alessandra is satisfied enough, or perhaps
no,
she
I have a small question for Carolyn. I would like that we know that a lot of artists claim that they are discriminated, that they don't have the same option that
opportunities
other artists has. I consider the field of contemporary art more open than many other fields, because but they should be fine. They should be lucky to find curators which are open-minded and they want to innovate. They want to not rely on the main field of research, on the main body of research. I imagine that in history of the art there is the attempt always to innovate. So this is already a specific field, a special field. But I wonder what you could answer to this, to the artists that they feel that they are discriminated.
Well, that's also a very good question. It's a tricky question. I kind of feel like I'm stepping on ice right now, because a person's words can be extracted. My words can be extracted from this talk that you're going to put on the internet and be terribly misused. So I feel like I'm treading on a very thin layer of glass, because we live in a very, very controlled and censored world. The internet is also a world where immediately you get attacked for something you say. again, because of the bubbles and the misunderstandings that can happen on the internet, the tremendous misunderstandings. So you're asking me a question where I cannot really, in a few minutes, briefly reply. I imagine, I mean, I can only reply in a very banal way, so I will. There are certainly some artists who are underprivileged because they emerge and they work not in the centers of the art world. So if you're not in the center of London, but you're in, on top of a hill in Madagascar, it is more difficult for art critics and curators to from all over the world to actually come across your work. So the banal thing that I'm saying is that where you're located physically, your body, it may matter in your career. That is for sure true. The fact of saying that two artists are in London right now, one is from the top of the hill in Wales, and one is from the top of the hill in Bamiyan, outside of, in Afghanistan, and one is from downtown London. I don't think that there is discrimination generally. No, I don't think so.
Yes, Carolyn, my answer is different from yours. I always tell them, but listen, also Van Gogh, the big painter, were ahead of the time, and they became famous in the late part of their life, even when they died. So probably the content of your art, the atmosphere, so the public, I don't know, were not ready. Am I wrong, or you, because you are providing an answer which is very, for an economist, is very easy. So the location, there is a cost of location, information, you can make a model, understand very easily why one is find opportunity, the other one. Instead, what about the culture that is not ready for this type of
Well, you're pushing me to answer it in a controversial way because you repeated the question in a more precise way. Right now is not 10 years ago. Right now is now. If we were 10 years ago, I would have said, yes, there's discrimination, for sure. If you're a woman artist, if you're Black, if you're Indigenous, there's discrimination. That is not what I see today in the art world. That is 10 years ago. Right now, we see an art world where, and here's the controversial part, if you're a white male heterosexual and you're like 40 years old, I don't think you're going to get a solo show at a main museum right now. You're not.
So you are discriminated.
No, I didn't say that. I just said that you're not going to get an exhibition. I mean, look what happened with a dead white male heterosexual with Philip Gaston, The Philip Gaston show was canceled for years, and then it finally happened. So I cannot say that we are living in a period in the art world where there is discrimination in the way that I believe you are alluding to. You are not saying it openly either, and I'm not replying openly. I'm just saying that I believe 10 years ago I would have said yes, and now I'm not saying that anymore. I'm observing a very different art world, a very different art world from 10 years ago. And so,
okay. So,
I can't say that right now. I can't say that. For example, one of the reasons why the digital art world is not totally accepted by the traditional art world is because most of the authors are artists from, California or some Canadians, and they're mostly male and they're mostly white. And so the museums are not saying why they're not including this work. Nobody is saying it, but it is a fact that is untold. It's untold. So in certain ways, we are delaying the understanding of a certain material, which is the digital information running around, because most of these projects are somehow connected with the material social media, and the material social media is being sculpted in certain ways, and that includes using numbers and money. When you talk about NFTs and so on, people take a moralistic stance against it, and they say, "Oh, that's just speculation." But I don't think so. I think that we live in an age of numbers, and the digital means numbers. When you scan an object, you're making numbers, and you're transforming an object into numbers. So it is quite normal that there is the rise of the cryptocurrencies that are numbers, and that the material of the artwork is also those numbers and in the flow. And there are great artists like Pak, used to be Murat Pak, anonymous artist, the artist who sold $20 million of NFTs to pay for the lawyers of Julian Assange. An incredible artist. And that incredible artist, who is maybe a collective, and maybe we don't know, we don't know the gender, we don't know the color, we don't know anything, but except that it was formerly Murat Pak, but also from Turkey. But Murat Pak is also a question whether Murat Pak was a single person or a collective already. And we certainly don't know who Pak is today. But the fact that the art world is slightly reluctant to engage with this new art is also because of a kind of inhibition right now going on in the art world. Which I don't want to go further into, but I repeat, today is not 10 years ago.
Yes.
Now it's if you're a woman artist, it's almost. Well, first of all, I don't want to even go down this alley. To go down this alley means to put words in a way that I think is not right. The minute I say it's easier for women artists today than for men artists, when 10 years before it was the opposite, I hate my word, because I'm categorizing a person as a woman. And why should I categorize a person as a woman? That makes no sense. In an era of total gender autonomy and gender blurring, and anybody can be anything they want. They can be a fish if they want. So I don't believe in these categorizations. I don't want to put names to things. I don't want to say that this is discriminated and that's discriminated. But I respect the position of any artist that may have said, I feel that I was not chosen because I was discriminated. I respect that, and I would certainly talk to them about it. And I can remember talking with Grada Quilomba about this question. She was not chosen for the Pavilion of Portugal at the last Venice Biennale. She was in the shortlist for the pavilion, and a great artist. That's why I'm talking about Grada. I'm talking about her because of her being a great artist. But I remember many conversations where she felt discriminated, and that she should have gotten that pavilion, and she didn't, because of certain things that she learned had happened in the conversations of the committee. I was not in those conversations. I don't know if it's true or not, but it is possible that she was discriminated. I don't know. In any case, she immediately was called to direct the Sao Paulo Biennale, which is opening in shortly, so September. So that tells you that there's a huge art world that also would never discriminate Grada Quilomba to the degree that she probably got the Sorbonne Finale also as a consequence of this little, what do you call it, crisis that happened in Venice. So, I mean, if we look at things case by case, we can come to some truths. If we look at it generally speaking, we cannot, because all our discussions will be biased in any case, and any analysis of statistics is biased by the preconceptions. You know, I might think that you have a preconception that some artists are discriminated, and that's why you wanted to organize this event, you know, and you wouldn't have organized it if you didn't think that. So everything is situated, your knowledge, my knowledge, everybody's knowledge. And I think that that's what I can say on this subject.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank
The
you.
last question by Gianmaria Iani, who is a lawyer and expert in art and artificial intelligence.
Hello?
Good afternoon. Yes,
Hi.
thanks, Alessandro, for inviting me. And I teach a course on law and art here at the University of Torino. I think that when we talk about multiculturality and art, in a way, we also would have to look at what happens outside, out from the museums. And I'm thinking to art in public spaces and monuments. I think that we all agree on the fact that the physical spaces where we have a multicultural meeting of people are the shopping malls and the commercial centers in our cities. We cannot say the same for places of public art. And we also know that municipalities do not have so much resources to be spent in order to promote art in public spaces. So I would like to interview you about what you think on the, let's imagine a city, could be Milano, Torino, Naples, Rome, where multiculturality is a fact. What do you think those in the policymakers could do and should do in a shortage of resources? Better to invest in supporting and producing new interventions in order to be more inclusive and updated with current situations in our cities, or trying to reactivate the meaning of traditional old monuments we have all around in order to tell something about the place to the ones living in the city and to the new generations having arrived here recently?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and to end with. So I think that I'm going to give it a go. So, so the question, if I understood correctly, is given that we have very few resources, municipalities and so on, like Torino, let's say, is it more useful to valorizzare, to establish value around traditional local monuments and stories and histories that define the city, its past, in order to make them more known to the new population, which is a hybrid population made of people from many places, or to commission artworks by different people from different communities
Exactly.
that have arrived
Yes.
in the city. Okay, so if I understood that correctly, well, if you understood even 5% of what I said before, obviously I cannot say one is better than the other. I can say 50-50. I mean, the logical thing to do is to do both, because both of them are important. It is very, very important for newcomers to know the past of the place they are rooted, they will be rooted in, and where their children will grow people grow up. I mean, that is very, very important. But it's not only important for the people who were born somewhere else, it's important for the people born in Torino from Torinese, because there's a watershed moment with television, in 1955, 56, let's say from the 60s, when people had it in the houses. It's a watershed moment, and accelerated by the internet, which has homogenized people all over the world. The global, like the airport syndrome, where everybody in Torino has grown up watching, American TV, and people in America have grown up listening to Japanese rock bands and so on. So there's a homogenizing effect of the media, which has caused a kind of depression. Communities are less proud of their own histories and their own local knowledges and traditional knowledges, and that is a pity. So it's not only a problem for someone coming from Dakar, it's a problem for someone born in Torino, Piedmontese parents. But surely understanding where one is, understanding where one lives, understanding the past of where one lives is fundamental to human joy, to the feeling of belonging, and the measuring, I'm sure, the joy of people. At the same time, introducing and allowing these communities, migrant communities, to be proud of their new country and their new living conditions means also to identify in the public space with things that they understand and that they have brought and contributed to the community. So, of course, that's important. I mean, again, the risk otherwise is, again, caused by the internet, which is those bubble communities, which is the way that, Italians going to the US in the 1920s and 30s or late 1800s, they had to break with the past so much. And so they learned their English quickly and so on. Now you can live your whole life and be an immigrant and be completely connected with the origin of your diaspora. Actually, a very important writer and friend, Arjuna Padurai, wrote quite a lot about this topic. In the 1990s, he wrote a lot about migrant communities that keep their identity totally connected to the original identity because of the websites and the constant communication with their friends in the other place. So harder to learn the language of the new place you arrive in and so on. So so I'm not adding anything to what Padurai wrote brilliantly, but so these two problems are surely balanced in a good 50-50, I would say.
Thank you.
Grazie, Carolyn.
So thank you so much.
No, we thank you so much that find
Thank
the
you.
time.